University, and I also direct our Institute for the Study of International Migration. I welcome you to this plenary session on migration and human development. I can see that both because it's been a rainy Saturday morning and the sessions are often running a bit late, that we're going to probably continue having people come in. But also, I suspect we're not going to be quite at the level of attendance as last night. We neither have a president amongst us nor the rock stars, Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. But in the migration field, we actually do have the rock stars with us today. We're just delighted that we could bring together four of the scholars on international migration who have really made a huge contribution to the understanding of the connections between migration and development. All have been working for years on these issues. And they really bring to the discussion a great deal of knowledge and expertise with regard to the issues, but in many cases with regard to the headlines as well. And although this is not a plenary that's going to be looking specifically at any particular migration or refugee issue, of course, what's happening in Europe today, in the Middle East, Africa, will come into our discussions, as well as the continuing, much more regular type of migration that we also see throughout the world, and has seen both growth and shifts in terms of the numbers of people, where they're going, and what the causes and the impacts of that migration may be. This is not a session with formal presentations. We thought it would be much more interesting for us to have a conversation about the issues. All of us end up in the same meetings, but they're mostly migration meetings. I think that we attend, and I think all of us felt this was a great opportunity to talk about some of the issues on which we work related to migration and development with development experts, both people who are working in the academic sphere on development, as well as practitioners and policymakers. So I'm really looking forward to not only our conversation, but engaging with those of you who are in the audience. We're going to begin the conversation with Hein de Haas, who until very recently was directing the International Migration Institute at Oxford, and now is a professor of sociology at the University of Amsterdam. Hein, you wrote a very important piece. I assigned it to my students. I hope a few of them have managed to get here, although 10 o'clock on a Saturday, a little bit doubtful. But it was entitled International Migration, Remittances and Development, Myths and Facts. But what I'd like to know is really, what are your current thoughts on that topic? Are there still some myths we need to dispel, or either new issues or continuing concepts about migration and development that you think that this audience should be considering?
Thanks, Susan. Thanks for the invitation to be here. In the article, which is now 10 years old, I tried to argue that the so-called destination country bias in migration research, which is the overwhelming tendency of migration researchers to be interested in what migration means for the United States or Europe, actually obstructs a real understanding of both the nature, causes and consequences of human migration. So we need to really fundamentally rethink the relation between development and migration, and also the tremendous usefulness of the capabilities approach in doing so. And this is, since I've written that article, also been my main emphasis. And in the paper, to illustrate this need for rethinking, I used those 7 myths that pervade in research, policy, and popular thinking. Now, I think a lot of progress has been made over the last 10 years, particularly because there's been much better research now on migration, particularly from a global development perspective, from an origin country perspective. But of course, many myths still persist and somehow are reinvented regularly, and I'll come back to a few of that. But instead of running again through the 7 myths, because I can refer to the paper, and also to acknowledge the progress that has been made, I'd rather like to formulate a number of affirmative statements rather than myths. And I'll make the 3 statements here and I'll briefly elaborate on those 3 statements. First, migration is development. Second, development leads to more migration, not less. And 3, migration is no development game changer. And I think these 3 statements highlight a lot of the evidence we've seen appearing over the last 10 years. So, to unpack the first statement, migration is development. I think on the individual level, we can argue that migration is development because most forms of migration, of course not all forms of migration, but most forms of migration, are part of an active quest, a deliberate quest by individuals and families for better opportunities and well-being, instead of this desperate flight from poverty and misery, which may dominate the headlines, which does exist, but is not the main substance of migration. And this also necessitates to redefine human mobility, not so much as people moving around, but as a capacity in itself or a freedom of people to choose where to go and live, which also includes the freedom to stay. And then in sort of sense terminology, migration becomes the associated functioning. So you can be mobile in terms of having the liberty to move around. Doesn't mean you have to move around. And you can derive well-being from the fact that you have the awareness of having that freedom of mobility. But also on the macro level, migration is development, because migration is an intrinsic part of development processes, rather than somehow the antithesis of development. And that is pretty evident if we look at evidence on the association between development processes and migration, which clearly emphasize that we need to steer away from obsolete push-pull models, which do not really help us understand real migration patterns in the world. They're actually quite misleading. There's increasing evidence that in poor societies, in particular, human development generally leads to more migration for 2 main reasons. On a structural level, that with human development, societies become structurally more complex, for instance, through increasing education, occupational specialization, often requiring more mobility, for instance, to match jobs and people's qualifications. And second, because development, such as through increasing incomes, education, access to information, generally increases people's life aspirations and also capabilities to move around. And we know that from the literature. It is therefore no coincidence that the so-called emigration champions of the world are typically middle-income countries. To go through the third statement, migration is no development game changer, we come to the core of this whole debate about migration and development. Some also have dubbed it as brain gain versus brain gain. Now here we've seen a sort of pendulum-like movements ever since the Second World War, from a phase of post-war optimism about freedom of mobility contributing to development in origin and destination countries, particularly in the European context, to a long phase of pessimism from the 1970s onward about the brain drain, basically, that migration deprives origin countries of vital human resources and actually hinders, obstructs development. And in more recent years, Emma Neighbor has played an important role here, and other researchers have emphasized the importance of migration, in particular remittances, in actually potentially enabling development in origin countries. But I think, and that's really happened since the last 10 years, we may be on the backswing to a new phase of pessimism. And I think these are often ideologically driven. For instance, the latest book by Paul Collier, Exodus, clearly reinvents the brain drain. That's not a new argument, but it reinvents it, and it's politically convenient. And I often think both swings to the optimism and to the pessimism often reflect also broader mood swings in thinking about migration and development. So they're often quite ideologically influenced. And of course we need a more nuanced view, because again there is so much good research now, and look at several people here in the audience who've conducted that research and here on the podium, on the development implications of migration, which of course provide a much more nuanced view and also emphasize that we need to nudge this migration and development pendulum more towards the middle. What do we know from research? First of all, I think the evaluation of development impact of migration depends on levels of analysis and context. If we look at the micro level, and again adopting a capabilities point of view, we need to appreciate the considerable and real contribution of both international and internal migration in improving the daily lives and long-term well-being of migrants and their families. That does not only account for expenditures on nutrition, education, healthcare, and businesses, but also for house construction or building a church or a mosque or a pilgrimage. As long as it contributes to people's well-being, that is development from an individual point of view. For instance, house construction has often been lamented by researchers as being a non-productive investment. I always say to my students, probably the first thing you'll do when you get your first permanent job is probably buy a house and as big as possible. So who are we to tell migrants they shouldn't construct a house? So that is a very double morale here. But of course, those real micro-level contributions, which have been proven by so much research, does not mean that this means development on a national level. And I think here it's very important to, again, it's something that's been said before, years ago, that migration is not a development panacea. That despite the considerable benefits for migrants, their families and communities, migration and remittances alone cannot remove structural development constraint. So that brings me to that last statement, that migration is no development game changer. Migration can neither be blamed for a lack of development, so the brain drain argument, or to be expected to trigger sort of take-off development in very unattractive investment environments. And at risk of talking myself out of business, this points to the relative unimportance, I think, of migration. That's perhaps an insight that has become bigger because migration researchers tend to concentrate on migration. But in a way, we need to understand migration as part of the broader change and also understand the relative limited place of migration. It can play a positive role. It doesn't have to play a positive role. So to finish, what do we make of that debate? Is migration good for, let's say, national development in origin countries or not? Of course, it's impossible to make a blanket statement on this because I think from research, we see both vicious and virtuous development cycles linked to migration possible on the macro level. Empirical research has shown that migration can both sustain vicious and virtuous development circles. If states fail to implement reform, if investment conditions are very unattractive, migration is very unlikely to fuel macro-level development and can sustain structural remittance dependency, underdevelopment, and authoritarianism. I think the country I've studied a lot, Morocco, is probably a good example. Individuals and families and communities have benefited massively from migration, but you can't make the argument that migration has triggered a sort of national growth process. But we also have examples of virtuous circles. If development takes a positive turn and political and economic reform occurs, migrants are likely to reinforce those positive trends through investing and returning. And here I think a few examples, South Korea, Turkey, Kerala, are probably examples of cases. It's not migration that has triggered the development, but of course the development conditions improving, also migrants saw a lot of opportunities and then reinforced that positive cycle. I think later we go back to the policy options, so I better stop here because I have some thoughts on that, but that's more or less what I make of my article 10 years later. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. We're going to continue with each of the questions and then come back to a little bit more general discussion. I welcome those who are still coming in. Dilip Ratha, who's next to Hein de Haas, has probably been the most important person in unpacking issues with regard to remittances, which are, of course, an extremely important part of the migration story, the money that migrants send back to their home communities. He is an economist at the World Bank, and very importantly began a program at the bank called the Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development, which is bringing practitioners and scholars together on a lot of different issues. I have the good fortune to chair the working group on environmental change and migration, but there are working groups that have looked at a variety of other issues. Dilip, financial remittances have grown significantly over the last decade or so. And in many cases, countries, they exceed foreign direct investment, foreign trade, certainly cumulatively, and in individual countries, they are way, way, way beyond official development assistance. So what's the current trajectory? Kind of where are we? What impacts do you see already, and where do you think this whole set of impacts are heading?
Thank you, Susan. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for inviting me. Just to sort of take you back a little bit before talking about remittances, I just wanted to mention a couple of stylized facts. You know, there are about 250 million international migrants now. There are 750 million internal migrants. That's about 1 billion people who have migrated out of their home, 1 out of 7 people in the world. And they all send money home. Well, most of them do, 80% of them, 90% of them do. Out of the billion people we talked about, or in the case of international migration, 250 million people, 93% are economic migrants who have migrated to get a job, and there is an employer on the other side, so they get paid. It's all legal because somebody is paying, and then they send money home. So that's where the remittances come from. And just to again highlight or reiterate that point, emphasize that point, you know, the whole refugee crisis now, somewhere around 17 million people, 16 million something, that's only 7.1% of international migrant stock. That is only 0.22%, 1/5 of a percentage point of the world population. And this is not even a historic high. So again, putting things in context, most of the migration is economic. They are sending money home. So remittances are the most tangible sort of link. And I would say the sort of flow that we have understood better, the link between migration and development. Remittances are the most tangible link between migration and development. This year, 2015, we are expecting remittances to exceed $440 billion. That is only recorded remittances. If you added the flows that are not recorded, it would be larger than that. At $440 billion, they are already larger than 3 times, more than 3 times the size of official aid, which is $135 billion. In Egypt, remittances are larger than the revenue from Suez Canal. In Nigeria, they are larger than foreign direct investment. In Morocco, they are larger than tourism receipts. In Nepal, remittances are 10 times larger, maybe 15 times larger than tourism receipts. And we had the crisis recently, the earthquake in Nepal. Nepal receives about $6 billion in remittances, per month about 500 million in remittances. In those months of May, June, July, I expect the remittances to Nepal might have gone more than twice, maybe 3 times. And I really was very happy when a lot of remittance companies waived the fees on remittances to send money home. If you think that average remittance costs are 5%, 5% of $6 billion, that's way larger than any kind of aid you can think about through, you know, passing the hat around. That's the beauty of remittances. They are large, they go to poor people, they are counter-cyclical in the sense that when the country is in difficulty, more money goes in. And because of that, the development impact of remittances is significant. They reduce poverty. Again, taking the case of Nepal, there was a reduction of 11 percentage points in the share of poor people in the population between 95 and 2005. 11 percentage point decline in poverty headcount rate when the country was going to dogs with the politics and with the economics. Most of that, about half of that, is attributed to remittances, and a large part of the remittances are actually coming from India, another poor country. Again, that brings us to the point that actually south-south migration is larger than south-north migration, poor people helping out each other. In other words, again, to re-emphasize the point that Hein made, migration, both emigration as well as immigration, is intimately related to development. Remittance recipient families use the money for all sorts of purposes, but there is strong evidence that in Sri Lanka, remittance recipient families had children whose birth weight was higher than other families. In Mexico and El Salvador, the school dropout rate was lower among remittance recipient families' children than other households. So these are sort of the development outcomes. So where are we heading with this right now? So that's where it would be good to sort of think about this sort of global remittances agenda, where we talked about data, we talk about retail payments, we talk about linking remittances to financial inclusion at household level, and linking remittances to big financing for development at the country level. On remittance costs, on the retail payment systems, it is a shame that the average cost of sending money is about 8% even now. The cost of sending money to Africa is still about 12%. Within Africa, sending money is more like 20%. And then you have the situation of India, Bangladesh. I strongly believe that Bangladesh to India is the largest migration corridor in the world. It is not Mexico to the US. And even there, India does not allow remittances to Bangladesh. Bangladesh does not allow remittances to India. What that means is, in economic terms, remittance costs are infinite through the formal channel. And then you have the case of Venezuela. If you send $100, the family on the other side will receive about $1 now because of the exchange rate problem. In other words, you can't use a formal channel. So reducing remittance cost is an important agenda, and that would continue to be an important agenda for the next 3, 4, 5, or maybe even 10 years. And in that context, creating a remittance platform using modern technology is the way to go forward, and a lot of activities are seen in that area. The area where I don't see any activity, or not much anyways, is linking remittances to financial products for household level, for poor people. So in terms of providing savings, in terms of providing small consumer loans, in terms of providing perhaps opportunities to buy medical insurance, that remains a fertile ground for experimentation. And I'm beginning to hear about a couple of firms, maybe 5, a handful of them, already beginning to think about that. One element that excites me in that area is the whole point that, for a large number of low-skilled migrants, they migrate, they pay a recruitment agent something like 36 months, 48 months, 24 months of expected wages. A Bangladeshi worker, you and I were there in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, in a labor camp once. It's the same people. Yeah. Bangladeshi workers, construction worker, pays about $5,000 to get a construction job in Dubai or Abu Dhabi. For a job that pays about $1,800 per annum. $1,800 per annum. That means that it takes about 3 to 4 years before he can pay back just the recruitment cost. All of that is illegal. And if so, it so happens that he has taken a loan for that amount, and the interest rate is 50%, which often is the case, that person is a bonded labor, a slave, a modern-day slave for life. For the first 3 years or so, at least for 2 years or so, many of these migrants are sending money home. Remittances are going in, not for the family, but to just pay those illegal recruitment fees. One of the experiments that I would love to see and mainstreamed is somehow linking remittances to provide loans to the migrants who are thinking about migrating to pay the migration costs. So that's where I see a lot of action in the coming years, and some experimentation is just beginning now. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Kathleen, Kathleen Newland is one of the founders of the Migration Policy Institute here in Washington, but also with offices in Brussels. And MPI is arguably the most effective and consistent producer of data and research and information on migration. Kathleen has been following the issues of migration and development for a long time, and particularly through the lens not of the money that migrants send, as much as the migrants themselves and the diasporas that they form in their new countries. Could you tell us more about what role particularly the diasporas play, particularly with regard to human development and the building of capabilities? And what recommendations do you have for development scholars and practitioners as they may be thinking about engaging with diasporas, who are an important source of information, et cetera?
Great, thank you, Susan. I'd be very happy to address those issues very briefly. First, I'm going to make some generalizations about diasporas. since I only have 8 minutes. So I want to make clear at the outset that diasporas are not homogeneous, that they operate across a wide range of areas and with a lot of different effects. Some diasporas have malign impacts on their countries of origin, those who are funding conflict or supporting divisive political movements and so on. But I am going to focus more on the positive here because we are talking about the impact of diasporas on human development and capabilities. And I do think that by and large, that's a positive effect. I think mainly the positive effect is because diasporas tend to blunt some of the sharper edges of globalization. Most writing about diasporas tends to focus on the economic impact of diasporas, with some very notable exceptions, one of whom you're about to hear from after this. But the economic impacts aren't the only, or in my mind, even the most important effects of diasporas. But let me start just briefly with economic effects. I think we see them most strongly in trade and investment flows. There have been a number of studies that demonstrate that the presence of a diaspora in a destination country is highly correlated with trade flows between the country of origin and the country of destination. And similarly with investment flows, both foreign direct investment and portfolio investment. Diaspora members tend to have contacts in their countries of origin. They tend to be more aware of opportunities in a country of origin, and they tend to have antennae that are more attuned to positive changes in political and social dynamics. So that, in very briefly, accounts for some of the effects, economic effects that you see of diasporas. One of the most debilitating effects of low levels of development, in my view, is isolation from the world economy, and particularly from the world knowledge economy. And so there's a sort of area that's lies between those sort of economic impacts and human development impacts, which are very much in this area of what diasporas bring in a positive nature to countries of origin, how they help to compensate for elements of human capital that many of the least developed countries in particular lack, and developing countries as well. Things like investment experience, business acumen and connections, exclusion. Many people in the private sector in developing countries are excluded from global supply chains, for example, and of course from access to capital, which gets back to the investment flows. But it's this inability to sort of break in to the more dynamic and productive aspects of globalization that I think is one of the characteristics of lack of development. And this is something where diasporas can really help forge those connections between their country of origin and country of destination. I'm thinking of individuals like a businessman called Dado Banatao, who's of Filipino origin, who developed one of the forms of chips that probably every one of you has in your pocket at the moment, and in the process became a billionaire, probably many times over. And Dado Banatao has taken his expertise in excuse me, in microelectronics and in the uses of those chips into the Filipino school system, starting in his hometown to develop online learning of the very highest standard for people in, isolated sort of small towns, small city schools. And the government of the Philippines eventually has adopted this as a nationwide program. So that's just sort of one example of how an individual can help break some of the isolation of developing countries from some of the productivity gains arising from modern technology and from the networking of knowledge and technology. And I think it's particularly when the combination of investment flows and knowledge and skill flows occurs, when people bring both knowledge and skills and technological investments or investments in industry together, that you get highly positive effects from diaspora engagement. And a few developing countries have really seen structures evolve to take advantage of the potential of those interactions. I'm thinking of a group called Chile Global, which Sonia knows very well since she and I have written about it together, where quite a small number of Chilean entrepreneurs were encouraged and took the initiative to invest in key sectors of the Chilean economy. Biotechnology was one of them, as you probably know. If you buy wine at the sort of mid to low level of the spectrum that I do, that Chile has a very large wine industry, and one of these Chilean biotechnologists working in the United States has made important contributions to the development and the upscaling of the Chilean wine industry. Not so upscale that I can't afford it yet, but still having some impact. That, I think, is the arena in which diasporas have a really important effect, not just on development, but on human development through the transfer of knowledge and skills and forming networks of, for example, so many of the Chinese scholars who came to study in the United States and remained in the United States to take important positions in top universities and laboratories have brought Chinese students to the United States, have supervised postdocs in China, spend part of their year in China in technology parks, and have really helped to spur the technological development of China. On the question of and let me just make one further point. I think that one of the impacts extremely important for human development when diaspora engagement really works at its best is a reduction in inequality. And we can discuss that in the, if you would like, after these remarks. On the question of what recommendations I would make for scholars and practitioners, should I dare to, I think the main one is to pay attention to migration. Once you start paying attention to migration, you notice that it's everywhere. I mean, that it impacts almost every arena of human activity and human development. The numbers, as Dilip mentioned, of 250 million migrants worldwide, that is people who are living outside their country of birth, is, in my view, a gross underestimate of the impact of migration. It's not just those 250 million, which is a snapshot of any given point of time, but the people who will migrate, the people who try to get an education that will equip them for migration, the people who have migrated and returned, the families of those who migrated, and the communities that are affected by the not only the resources, but the attitudes and the opportunities that they bring back. So that's my first piece of advice to both scholars and practitioners, is just to think about migration in the context of whatever else it is that you do. And I'd be surprised if there were very many of you who didn't find that it's highly relevant. For scholars of human development, I think an important starting point is that mobility is a critical capability for human beings. In other words, that freedom of movement has intrinsic value as well as the instrumental value that we often talk about, that it brings remittances, that it helps people educate their children. It's just something that people value, many people value. And so I think that it deserves a sort of place at the center of the human development agenda. And for practitioners, a similar piece of advice is just open your eyes. I mean, I am astonished when at the many interactions I have with development practitioners who just don't even think about migration. And given that, as Dilip said, remittances is a hugely important part of foreign exchange flows to many developing countries, which has an impact not just on the households that receive those remittances, but on the balance of payments, on the debt service burden of those countries, on their credit rating in international markets. And Dilip has written about this very eloquently. But I mean, the flows, even just the strictly financial flows that are associated with migration, are hugely important in the economic stability of developing countries. And the knowledge and skill flows and the connections that I've talked about briefly are probably even more important in raising the capabilities of both people who migrate, people who associate with people who migrate, and their countries of origin. So let me leave it at that, Susan.
Great. Well, it's a great transition to Peggy Levitt, who is a professor at Wellesley College and coined the term about 20 years ago now of social remittances to try to broaden this understanding of what it is migrants send home. And Peggy, I know you've written more recently, kind of updating and thinking anew about the concept of social remittances. And I've struck in that article in 2012 that you also spoke about bringing culture back into migration. And so I'd like to hear from you is how, just what do you mean by bringing culture back? What do you think is happening now with social remittances, and how important is it as a component of human development?
Thank you. Thank you, Susan, and it's an honor to be part of this illustrious panel this morning. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to try to speak up to those of you up there. I did coin the term social remittances, and it's hard to believe that it was 20 years ago. And that was a response to what I saw as the overemphasis on sort of the economic aspects of the migration development equation, and a lack of recognition of the idea that skills and ideas and values and identities and social capital were circulating between sending and receiving countries. So the people in the Dominican village where I first did my original field work, who had never moved, but who could tell me that US politicians got sanctioned when they broke the rules, or when you go to the bank on Friday, the person who's wearing the suit and the person who's a worker both have to stand in line to cash their check. These were changing people's ideas about democracy and about inequality and about gender, and they were transforming both the society of origin, but also what people brought with the next wave of migrants brought with them when they migrated anew. And you mentioned this more recent article that I wrote with my colleague Deepak Lambanieves, where we tried to revisit some of the formulation in the first iteration of social remittances, and to stress the idea that, and I think it's important on this panel to drive this home, that they are both positive and negative, and that they are circular, so it's not a one-way flow between the receiving country back to the sending country, but that in fact what people bring with them very much influences what they get exposed to and then what they ultimately send back, and then the sort of iterative circulation that continues after that. And that social remittances have the potential to scale up and scale out. And so by that we meant that if I now think that there should be accountability and transparency in budgeting for a health project, I will also scale that out to an education project. Or if I think that politicians should be held accountable at the local level, I'll also have that expectation for politicians at the provincial level or at the national level. And so what I see is that there's a next generation of research that's studying aspects of social remittances empirically, and some of these researchers want to make a distinction between social remittances, cultural remittances, political remittances, intangible remittances, and but I think that all of this research is adding up to show us how these kinds of flows are influencing behavior and outcomes and development in multiple sectors. So for example, politics, whether we're talking about voter turnout or voter preferences for greater democracy, or whether we're looking at Mexico or Mali or Moldova, families with migrants are more likely to vote and are more likely to choose more democratic parties. Philip Barg's work on the role of social remittances in demographic transitions also shows that people who go from North Africa and the Middle East to the West are more likely to have lower fertility rates and smaller families, although people who migrate from the same areas to the Gulf are likely to stay the same or have even more fertility. So there's good evidence, I think, from research on health that shows these kinds of mixed outcomes. So for example, Frank found that Mexican women with international migration partners had lower rates of smoking and higher rates of exercise and were more likely to gain weight in pregnancy, but they were less likely to exclusively breastfeed their babies. And in a study that I was involved in about return migration, to the effect of return migration on healthcare to India and China, we found that there were a lot of positive individual effects. So people came back more willing to take risks and more willing to be creative and challenge authority, but that the institutional outcomes were fostered greater inequality because there were better outcomes for healthcare institutions serving the middle class and up rather than institutions serving the poorest of the poor. So yes, I think social remittances matter in both positive and negative ways for sending and receiving communities, and I think we're seeing more and more that that's being backed up by the literature. Which brings me to my second point, which is about the relationship between migrating people and migrating culture, which I still think is understudied and integrated into our conversations. So in this contemporary world on the move, 1 in 7 people is an amazing statistic. How does the movement of people contribute to and transform the movement of culture? And then how, in turn, does cultural circulation enable the movement of bodies and the social relations and processes that are unleashed as a result? So what I'm saying is that we can't just look at the migration of culture or religion or ideas or political attitudes or business practices, but that we need to see migration as an inherently cultural act. Because migrants' identities and actions are rich in cultural and social meaning, focusing just on networks or positions or activities comes up short, because it's not when and that these practices or identities may be cultural, but that they're inherently cultural. And by culture, I mean the discourses, regimes, and assumptions embedded in the institutions and the repertoires of meaning that help us as individuals respond to opportunities and dilemmas. So culture makes certain kinds of actions possible by giving us the building blocks with which to construct them, but also by making them socially appropriate and by deeming other things inappropriate. So yesterday when I was listening to Professor Sen and Professor Nussbaum, I was struck by how aspirations and capabilities and even what we think of as development is really culturally defined. And, you know, thinking about programs maybe to do binational health care insurance, well, it's going to be culturally defined whether people want more remittances to be able to pay for the health care of their migrant relatives, or whether they're going to do it through institutional channels and have trust in those institutional channels. So in addition to the circulation of social and cultural remittances, I want to suggest that we could add several other aspects to the conversation. One thing is to think about the cultural, what I think of as the cultural armature of cities. So cities over time have these deep cultural structures that are laid down by cities and nations that are laid down by the founding fathers and mothers. And these deep cultural structures take root and really affect the kind of collective understanding about who we are as communities, but also what's our collective responsibility to take care of those less fortunate, how do we understand social stratification, et cetera. And so I think that we need to take those kinds of deep cultural structures and how they affect the policies and the institutions that a city and a nation create into account. One piece of this is what we could think of as a diversity management regime. So countries and cities have very different ways of both talking about, measuring, remediating difference, and whether they think that the state has a role to play in that or not. So if we were in Germany or in Sweden, we probably wouldn't talk a lot about race. In the United States, we talk about race a lot, although it's not a necessarily constructive conversation. If we're in France, the census measures, takes note of people's religious preferences. In the United States, we don't. And that means that the issue of how diversity gets framed, what information we have about it, and how it's supposed to be, and who and how it's supposed to be managed is culturally determined. And also how a country sees its role in the world and in trying to mediate inequality is also, there's also a cultural basis for that. So I don't think it's an accident that Sweden is taking in so many of the refugees in Europe right now, and I can say more about that. Another thing we could think about is how states use cultural policies to influence immigrant incorporation, or how membership in the community gets defined. So think about rules about headscarves in public places, or think about English-only legislation in this country. And that also reflects what the cultural institutions of a country does. So I just have published a book about how museums around the world are representing or not a more diverse nation? And do they teach us to be cosmopolitans either by helping us to embrace the diversity next door or across the globe? And that has a lot, what different museums do, whether it's Sweden or Denmark or Qatar or Singapore or the museums that I studied in the United States, has a lot to do with these deep cultural roots that I'm talking about. So I don't know how many of you were able to go to the mall and look at some of the museums on the mall. Well, there's a museum for women, there's a museum for African Americans that's going to open, there's a museum for Native Americans. That's because our diversity management regime in the United States is about hyphenated ethnicity, which means Americanness. So we think that labeling groups empowers them. If we were in Scandinavia, you would be hard-pressed to find a museum that was dedicated to one particular group, because the same empowering labeling in this context is seen as marginalizing in that context. And then finally, I just want to say that we could also look at how culture and immigration is part of the economic development strategies of different cities. So a while ago, I was involved in a project about Danbury, Connecticut, which is a deindustrialized city in the Northeast. And they were marketing, they had lots of immigration from Brazil, and they were marketing themselves as a good place to live because they were a multicultural paradise because of so much immigration. So here's another way that culture is being used to promote economic development, to rescale this city, that we should incorporate into our conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We've heard of quite a lot of different perspectives and aspects about migration, and turning a little bit more to policy, there's been a concerted effort to bring migration into the Sustainable Development Goals. Some of it's successful, not quite as much as I think many who worked on that issue for many months and years would have liked. How important is it to integrate migration and development into the post-2015 development agenda? Hein, you were sort of holding your policy stuff. Maybe I'll come back to you to start us off.
That's fine. I mean, I have some general considerations about policies, or do you want me to specifically focus on that question about the MDGs?
Yeah, let's start with the
I find it difficult to imagine how you can formulate a clear migration MDGs in terms of in 2020 or 30 we want so many people migrating. I think it's somehow strange, because I think for most people, if you think about development, of course migration is often a tool. It has an intrinsic dimension and it's a tool. The only way I can imagine formulating an MDG around migration is actually the intrinsic dimension. The idea that people derive well-being of having mobility rights, which means they have the option of migrating. It's like running for office. Most people don't run for office. You live in a democratic country, you know you can run for office, you derive well-being from that. It's the same with migration. And Jürgen Carling has written about the concept of involuntary immobility. There are many people around in the world that know they can't migrate, particularly to wealthy countries. That creates a migration obsession. Whereas in countries where there's free migration, I think French Guiana is a good example of a country in the Caribbean which is still a French department, where people are much more relaxed about migrating than, for instance, in Suriname or former British Guiana. So I think if I think about an MDG around migration, I'd rather formulate it around rights of migrants and the right to migrate, which is also likely to be very beneficial for development, because we know that one of the major obstacles for sort of releasing that development potential of migration is restrictive immigration policies. Because the paradox is, and there's so much research on this now, that immigration restrictions do to some extent indeed decrease inflows. But a recent paper I've written with Matthias Zeika at the IMI shows also, we use a lot of data from many countries, that they reduce return flows by the same degree. So you end up, what it actually means, you interrupt circularity, you push migrants in permanent settlement. Not that settlement is something negative, but we know that many migrants would like to have the option either to return permanently or temporarily, and we know, of course, that also facilitates this contribution, potential contribution of migration to human and economic development. So I think that is really key. And by only focusing, and I've been involved at quite an early stage, for instance, with the Dutch government, when they sort of discovered the whole issue of migration, remittance, and development, they wanted to develop a policy to stimulate migration and development. And at that time, I wrote a report called Engaging Diasporas. And the title was trying to allude to the fact that the Dutch government wanted to gear its development policy to stimulate this potential of migration to develop to migration. But their idea was, we need to engage migrants for development. And after interviewing many migrants in the Netherlands and their associations, I came to the conclusion those migrants have been engaged for development for a very long time. And they don't want to be told by governments how to do development in their origin countries. So countries better get their act together. That both goes for origin and destination countries. I think for origin countries, it's obvious that, of course, the more attractive circumstances are in terms of institutional environment, corruption, democracy, economic potential, of course, the more likely also migrants will either send money back or do business on distance or return or do all sorts of things people like migrants to be doing. But the same goes for countries of destination. And I think that is really the hot potato issue. And I think that's the major obstacle, and also in the Global Forum of Migration and Development, that of course migrant rights and more rights to mobility, better protection of migrants will in the first place enhance migrants' positions in destination countries in terms of the progress they can make, in terms of feeling member of that society, getting better access to education, income, which of course will also increase their capability to contribute to development in origin countries. So so-called integration and transnational engagement are no substitutes, they can be complements, despite many right-wing discourses which we hear nowadays where it's seen as a threat. People shouldn't engage anymore with their origin countries, they should assimilate. But second, immigration policies are the key here, I think. And that is really the key issue most wealthy countries don't want to address. Because obviously, giving more rights to migrants, giving more opportunities for people to migrate through legal channels, and Dilip just talked about the consequences of having no legal options to migrate, it often leads to huge exploitation. And of course, it marginalizes migrants, but it also decreases their option, the ability to circulate and to contribute their knowledge, money, and other resources in terms of development in origin countries. And that brings me back to that fundamental point, which also Kathleen has raised, that it's the intrinsic developmental value of migration, which does not mean people move, but having mobility rights mean you derive well-being from having the knowledge you have the option to migrate. And the paradox is that in countries with free mobility, in the so-called global south, immigration rates are often lower than in the countries that have no free mobility, because people get obsessed with moving out, invest a lot of resources in paying smugglers or getting a visa, and once you're in, you don't go back anymore. And that's the perversity of many of the policies and the sort of deadlock situation we're in. And this is obviously the main issue for many developing countries, to say you need to give more mobility rights because it helps us. One example, before, and many people don't understand this fundamental point, before 1991, Moroccans could move freely to most southern European countries, and so they did. There was no Schengen visa. They just took the ferry from Tangier to Algeciras in southern Spain, 15 kilometers only. They hopped on the ferry back and forth. They would either be adventurous like most young Europeans will do, they would just travel around. They may stay over for a summer to work a little bit, perhaps meet a girlfriend or a boyfriend, stay in Spain and go back to Morocco. Some would stay, but many people went back and forth. Or they would stay for a few years and went back. It was 1991. Schengen visa. The whole of Africa was more or less blacklisted, which also meant that countries that actually wanted free mobility with those countries, like Spain, were forced to introduce a visa for Moroccans. That was the date that permanent settlement really took off in Spain, and migrants couldn't go back. And this was actually the beginning of the so-called illegal boat migration movement in 1991. And obviously, I think it's very obvious that migration policies play a key role. And that is the issue that most northern, so-called northern countries don't want to address. So to me, that is the biggest obstacle right now in terms of thinking about how can we increase the development potential of migration.
I know Dilip and Kathleen, you were both very much involved in the almost weekly telephone calls. So could you give some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I quite like what Heinz said, but I just wanted to compliment by saying that actually the migration community is quite happy with the way migration has featured in the SDG discussion, and indeed in the Financing for Development document that talks about how the SDG goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, will be implemented. And there are three things that are already included. One is reducing remittance costs to 3% by 2030, and in no corridor, remittance costs should be more than 5%. That's an explicit goal. It's already included in both the Sustainable Development Goals as well as in the Financing for Development document. And in fact, now people are talking about whether even the 3% makes sense, shouldn't it be 0 or 1% or something. So that was one progress. The second area is a clear inclusion of the recognition of migration as a force for development. It is there, and it is there in better ways than we were expecting. So we have made progress on that one. And what is being promoted there is promoting safe and fair and legal migration. That's how the language is. And responsible migration.
Nobody quite knows what that means.
The language there is very generic, but then the next step is to think about metrics and indicators And that is where one can make a lot more progress. One area where the Financing for Development document has already included language on is on reducing recruitment costs for migrants, the one that I mentioned about the Bangladeshi worker. So that has made it into the Financing for Development document, and it is not yet there in the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm still hoping that later this month, when the General Assembly meets to decide on that outcome document, maybe they will bring that in. And another area which is still missing is mobilization of diaspora savings. That made it into the G20 Cannes document 2011, 4 years ago. Somehow it got dropped from the Financing for Development document. And to again quickly tell you why that is so important, I have been talking about the so-called $100 billion idea, $100 billion financing idea. Think of this. Official aid totally is $135 billion, and there is no hope that in the next 10 years it will increase any further. And here I am proposing an idea which is a conservative $100 billion idea. Quite likely it is more than the official aid. Here it is. If you reduce remittance costs from 8% to 3% on a $400 billion volume, that 5 percentage point reduction will save at least $20 billion. That's one. Diaspora savings are $500 billion plus per year. This is diaspora from developing countries. If you are really not very ambitious, you can take 1/10 of that as a target. 1/10 of $500 billion is $50 billion.
To invest.
To invest. And there are tools like diaspora bonds that are actually going to make that as an investment tool, a financing tool for investment. $50 billion in diaspora bonds. $20 billion in reducing remittance costs. And here is another statistic. If you reduce that $5,000 fee that the Bangladeshi migrant worker pays to the recruitment agent, if you eliminated it, that's $5,000. If you reduced it to $1,000, that's $4,000. For every migrant, you save $4,000. ILO estimates there are 10 million such migrant workers who are paying these kind of fees. Be less ambitious, make it 5 million. 5 million migrant workers saving $4,000 per person, that's $20 billion. That's my $100 billion idea right there, that two of them made it into the Financing for Development outcome document already. The $50 billion one, the elephant in the room, did not. I hope they noticed that. Then there is diaspora philanthropy, then there is skill transfer, technology transfer, then there is entrepreneurship, there is trade promotion. Here you go. We have made progress. There is still more to be done. Thank you.
Did you want to add anything?
Just, I won't add much because I'm a bit bipolar on the subject of the Sustainable Development Goals. There are days when I think they're just words on a piece of paper. Nobody's going to pay any attention to them anyway, so don't get excited about it. And then there are days when I say, no, these are things that the international community will repeatedly be called to account on. How are you doing on this target? How are you doing on that target? So if my message to policymakers is pay attention, then I think the sustainable goals may encourage them to pay attention to migration. I think the forms that there is no goal on migration, there are a few targets and indicators, and that's good. I think really migration in the SDGs is a bit like the talking dog. It's not so much what it's saying, but the fact that it's talking at all. So the fact that it is mentioned is a good thing.
Peggy?
I just wonder whether it would be useful to bring in insights from what some people refer to as the mobility turn in migration studies, and that is to sort of start with a world with people on the move rather than start with a world where they're static and rooted, and to pay attention to different kinds of mobility. So, should we nuance this conversation and say, well, what about people who want to permanently migrate, which, when people retire, they often go home, even if it's 25 years later. Short-term migrants versus circular migrants, whether these things are disrupted. Not to say that everyone equally has the ability to do this, but for me, turning the question upside down and saying, what does the world look like when we assume that people are going to move rather than stay in the same place is an interesting thought exercise that brings policy questions into view.
Yeah, I just would add one point of my a little bit of disappointment in the debate that it's leading up to the SDGs. And that's that a lot of what is in there is still very instrumental in terms of thinking about how to better use remittances and things of that sort, all of which I support. But where I think if you look at how in many of the documents leading up, how the important stakeholders or partners on development are described, there's a role for, of course, international organizations, governments, private sector foundations, but in articulating who is contributing to development, migrants are still absent as a group with whom we should be consulting and who should have a say in how development dollars are being spent, because with them, they're sending the largest amount back to many countries and yet still don't necessarily have a say in just what will be done with the development monies, except insofar as the narrow use of it by their own households on that. So I think we still have a lot more to go in terms of just getting the engagement of migrants, not in instrumental terms, but more in terms of that they have an intrinsic interest. I want to leave time, and we only have about 15 minutes left, so why don't we open this now for the Q&A and the discussion. The microphone is coming down. Yep, you need to go to it.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi, I was wondering if you had a comment on cultural change. Like, one of the things that I noticed with migration is loss of native language, native cultures, native tradition. And I've always struggled, is that good, is that bad, what's going to happen? And I'm wondering if you have any comments on that, on how culture changes or maybe even erodes, if I can use that language, as migration takes place.
Cultural change as a result.
Loss of language, loss of cultural identity.
I guess that's me. Are you going to take a bunch of questions?
No,
at
I
the
think
same
we'll
time?
take one at a time.
Okay. Well, I mean, what you raise is a deep and hard question, and I think many parents struggle with their, children's worrying about their children's lack of connection to their ancestral cultures and the kind of challenges that raises within families. And so another policy area, there's a lot of research that shows how kids who are bilingual and can code switch both culturally and linguistically do better in school, for example. So there are a lot of policies that can be put in place to kind of encourage people to preserve their culture and celebrate their culture rather than having to diminish that. So.
Yes.
Thank you.
And please introduce yourselves. Sorry, I should have mentioned that before.
Okay. Sonia Plaza from the Nomad program, working on diaspora issues, working with Dilith and the Nomads. I'm used to work with Kathleen on the diaspora since she moved to, again, refugees, but still we're working in the diaspora. I'm taking advantage that you're here, Peggy, and have a question on the cultural aspects on the refugees in the response approach of the cultural aspects. Because whenever you talk to people in Africa or in Latin America, they are completely saying, but what is so much noise in Europe, okay? Too much noise. Just to give you an example, in 1989, we had the same numbers, or a little bit higher, of refugees in the world. So we have not yet reached the highest. And then the only thing has changed, Africa still has a very large amount, equally, 4, 5, 6 in 1989, the same here. Latin America reduced the numbers of refugees, or Americas. South Asia has reduced, but the only change is Europe has received from 1.2, now they have 3 point something, which is the same number that Pakistan used to have, 3 or 4. So Europe having 3 million and Pakistan only 3 on the highest thing. So this is approach because in Latin America, for example, very used to receive a lot of refugees. When there was Argentina, Chile, everybody went to Peru, and we opened. Or everybody goes to Venezuela, now Venezuela, the Colombians goes, there was that. The same in Africa. Nobody says that, but Africa is a continent that has refugees, more largest refugee, and there was so much noise. So maybe it's in a cultural approach that Europe is not so diverse. Maybe the developing countries are more diverse. Maybe there's a lesson now on the cultural to learn how to integrate. Uganda has beautiful examples to integrate some people, a lot of people from Burundi. Can we learn from those lessons? I would like to get your views.
Kathleen, do you want to do it?
Yeah,
Or?
just, I mean, I think one point is that in the sort of high points of refugee movement that you mentioned, that most refugees are moving fairly short distances and to fairly culturally compatible, or at least familiar settings. So Latin America had mostly Latin American refugees. The sort of Afghan refugees are going to Pakistan and to Iran. African refugees going to neighboring countries. I think what is sort of different for Europe, and in the early 90s and through the mid 90s, Europe was getting European refugees from Russia, from the Western Balkans, and so on. I think one of the things that's different now is that the refugees are coming into Europe from a different region, from a region in which and with which there has been a lot of conflict, and layering that onto the experience of immigration from North Africa into European countries, and the frankly really lousy job that most European countries have done on integrating refugees. I think there's a lot of nervousness about precisely cultural compatibility and the ability to integrate. I'm tremendously encouraged in the last few months by the outpouring of goodwill from Europeans, and particularly from young people, towards Syrian refugees. And I am hopeful, and perhaps Hein and Jürgen and others in the audience can speak to this better than I, but I'm hopeful that that we're seeing something of a generational change in attitudes toward diversity and cultural accommodation, but it remains to be seen.
I mean, I fully agree with you, but I think also here, like Dilip already did on a global scale, it's very important to put things in perspective, because we may be very distracted, or we may exaggerate the scale of things by the media coverage it's getting, because of course it's unprecedented in terms of, if you look at an island like Kos or Lampedusa, but still to remind it, the about 300,000 refugees that cross European borders is of course a small percentage of total EU immigration, around 2.5 million a year. That doesn't mean it's not a big issue, it's not an important issue, there's no humanitarian crisis going on, but the suggestion, and I think that's what you were making, that in terms of quantity, this is something that European Union of 550 million inhabitants couldn't cope with, is of course, I think, quite an outrageous statement. And of course, politicians use this issue to raise, to rally support and to create certain fears. But I do agree with you that European countries have done a lousy job of integrating. Also here it's important to remind that a lot of the so-called, what is now seen as multicultural policies, were originally designed to prevent the integration of children of so-called guest workers from Turkey, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and Europe. The idea was they would go back. So the kids had to learn and to stick to their origin, culture, and language. In the countries of origin, were happy to collaborate. People were actively encouraged not to participate in European societies, because at that time, countries like the Netherlands and Germany still said, we are not an immigration countries. They are bound to go back. It had to last far until the 1980s, when those countries started to acknowledge in their policies that those migrants were there to stay. And in a way, that was too late. So they have indeed done a lousy job. But you can see with asylum, the sort of reluctance to accept that some share of those refugees are there to stay is translated in things like prohibiting them to participate in the labor market for years and years and years onward, which is the best recipe, of course, of creating marginalization and creating the perception that refugees don't integrate. And then the cultural agenda is raised. So in a way, this is a self-inflicted problem by European countries, and a refusal to accept that they have de facto become immigration countries. In fact, net immigration to the European Union has been higher for many years now than to the United States, for instance. So Europe has become the prime migration. So I think it's a policy failure, basically.
Yeah, well, instead of continuing though with integration, that one point I'd like to take is prerogative of the chair. One thing I agree totally with the way in which you raised the issue that this preoccupation with Europe is really taking attention away from where it is that countries really need help. I was in Lebanon a few months ago, and 25% of Lebanon's population are Syrian refugees. It's a small country, 4 million population, more than 1 million are refugees. Lebanon is not the most stable country in the world. It's not got a strong economy. And the World Food Program announced a few days ago that it has had to cut the rations for food aid to Syrian refugees by 30%. And so the Lebanese, the Jordanians, the Turks have been very, very open in keeping their borders open way beyond, and now they have had to close their borders because they can't sustain this level of population coming in, which of course is one of the reasons that there is this increased movement into Europe. What I was hearing from the Lebanese that I spoke with was their concern that their schools are now running on double and triple shifts. And so it's not just in order to get some education for the Syrians, they're having less education for their own population. And the fact that we're worried, as Heinz said, about a few, some hundreds, thousands, or even million in Europe, and for the U.S. as well, that we're worried about the integration of immigrants when countries like Lebanon, think about what 25% of the population would mean for any of our countries.
Just
Well, except that if there were 25 million, if it were that many million Canadians, it would not be such a big issue. And
That's the point.
Jordans and
Say
Jordanians and Lebanese and Syrians are very much of a sort of cultural continuity. So, I mean, I think
Yes,
on the
but-
cultural front, it's
but-
not, but the numbers are overwhelming.
Yeah, but think about the political relationships between Lebanon and Syria
Yeah.
over the years. You have to look at a wide array of
Well,
things.
partly arising from the fact that a lot of people don't think those are two different countries.
Just briefly, I mean, 90 to 95% of all Syrian refugees who have left the country are within the region.
Right.
First, it's very important to recall that, and it's often, and also countries like Turkey and Jordan host huge numbers of refugees.
And then
But
if
could
you
I
think
just-
about the Central African Republic, South
Yeah.
Sudan, the protracted crises that have been going on for 30 or 40 years, we have a lot more to worry about in terms of, as a development issue, about refugees in the developing world than we do about refugees in Europe or in the United
But
States.
I think Germany is now one country that in a way has changed its approach and also acknowledges that refugees, particularly from a country like Syria where many are skilled and come with resources, can be also beneficial in terms of, and there seems to now be a greater willingness, or in some countries people also discover if refugees come there which you can't send back, you better integrate them economically, and in the case of migrants with resources, you rather welcome them, instead of thinking them away, which I think has happened for a long time in Europe.
But we're not saying enough that it's a moral question. Not a cultural question, but a moral question. So when you ask this, you can think of a million examples in history where people's lives matter more than other people's lives, and that's what this is about.
Yeah.
And not having an out loud discussion about what's the moral responsibility of all countries around the world to step
Right.
up.
Okay. We're going to be able to take one more question, and unfortunately, I'm getting the time signal from our president.
Well,
What-
I guess mine is for the gentleman who hasn't spoke much during the comments here. And I wanted to get back to this notion of remittances, and I'd like to hear you comment on what we might think of as internal migration. So what about inter-country remittances and the effect of individuals moving to larger cities and sending back money into the smaller villages, and how this is handled and treated, and whether or not we're able to measure these effects? And I'd just like to hear you comment on that. Thanks.
I mean, I'm glad you asked that question. We have some sense of the scope of the size of internal migration, which is, as I said, 750 million or even larger. India alone, somewhere around 200 million. China alone, 300 million internal migrants. And that then goes to a point about, Hein made, and it also was reflected throughout, that migration is development. So as we think about economic growth, some sectors must grow faster than others. By the way, economic decline will have the same thing. Some sectors will fall faster than others. As long as you have sectors growing at different rates, people have to move. So you can't separate people movement from sectoral change, and you can't separate sectoral change from migration, from development. So migration is development. And this problem of people moving and sending back money, the problem side is recruitment, the benefit side is remittances, and we don't have estimates of internal remittances yet, even for India. Actually, the information on China is completely missing. And globally, there is no estimate of internal remittances. What we know is internal remittances are about 1/4, 1/10 of the average size of international remittances. So one person moving to US from India might send 10 times more than the same person moving from a village in India to, let's say, Mumbai, or maybe 1/4 the amount of if the person moved to Dubai. So that's the sort of numbers we know. But then, as you heard, 4 times, 5 times, 10 times more people are undertaking internal migration, meaning they are moving within the country than internationally. So I have a gut feeling, and I don't have any data, that internal remittances are larger than international remittances.
Anyway, please join me in thanking our panel. Very good discussion.
And I want to add my thanks, and I also have an announcement to add, but I really want to thank this panel and Susan Martin who put it together. This has been a wonderful way to connect this issue. This association is devoted to, is the mic on? Yes?
Yeah.
This association is devoted to human-centered development. You've got 1/7 of the world's people. This is people-centered development, the 1/7 of the world's people who are migrants, and then what we've also heard very eloquently is, well, there are the effects, of course, on capabilities of migration, but we've also heard eloquently from the panelists that migration or mobility is a central capability of intrinsic value that we ought to pay attention to. Now, many people at this meeting have been realizing this. We've got a great collection of people interested in migration at the conference, and so there's going to be an additional meeting during the lunch period when there are thematic group meetings. There's going to be a meeting of people interested in potentially starting a thematic group on migration. It will be in Salon A. Salon A is an Apple, so people interested in following up on these issues within the context of the association, please go to Salon A for lunch. Maybe I don't know if our panelists can stay, but in any case, let me invite another wonderful round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.